For those of you who have never met Reverend O'Connor, she's been, I guess you'd call a peripheral member of our Sangha for quite some time. Tonen discovered a love for visual art and theater during her time at Strathmore College when she majored in art history and was active in student theater productions. She went on to get a master's degree in drama, married, and went into what was to be 40 years of work in the professional theater as actress, director, and manager, finally spending 21 years as managing director of the Milwaukee Repertoire Theater. The Rep's tours to Japan in the early 80s introduced her to Zen Buddhism, and in 1986, she first experienced Zazen in a Japanese temple. Returning to Milwaukee, she became a practitioner at the Milwaukee Zen Center, where she was introduced to the teachings of Kosho Uchiyama Roshi by Tozen Akiyama, a close friend of Okamura Roshi's. Receiving Dharma transmission from the head teacher at Milwaukee Zen Center, and today serves as resident priest emerita, coordinating the prison program. Tonen is currently collaborating on the editing of Okamura Roshi's Dharma talks on the Japanese poet Ryokan to appear sometime this winter, and spearheading the creation of a book called Dharma Gates Are Boundless, featuring paintings by the African-American artist who is currently incarcerated and essays by 10 Zen teachers. I also want to say that Reverend O'Connor has been on Sanshin's board. Past couple of years, you are no longer on the board, but you are serving as part of the steering committee for a lot of things that are deciding the future, what Sanshin is going to look like after Okamura Roshi becomes a founding teacher. So we really appreciate your involvement in all of this. Thank you so much.
It's an enormous pleasure. It always has been. I said that I would talk about art today. And actually, art is very difficult to talk about. It really needs to be experienced. But I think we can talk maybe a little bit about what that experience means in terms of what we call Dharma. Now, we all have favorite forms of art. And I'm talking about the full range: painting, poetry, theater, dance, music, the written word, architecture, films. And they give us great pleasure. But I'm not sure we think about it as Dharma. I mean, sometimes we say, oh yes, there are wonderful books of Zen art, which essentially is the use of art to try to directly reflect, directly outline, if you will, teachings. And it's wonderful stuff. It's absolutely wonderful stuff. And symbols and signs like the Enso, the big energetic circle, have a lot of meaning for us. But I'm not sure that we think of art in general as Dharma. We may have a rather narrow idea of what Dharma is. So I want to go into just a little bit that word, Dharma. Dharma has three meanings, and we confuse them very easily. Dharma, perhaps with the capital D, is the truth of how things really are. The truth of how things really are. It's the ultimate understanding. The Dharma are the teachings about that truth. And we think primarily of initially the teachings of the Buddha, and then all the thousands of years of teachings and sutras since then. And we think of that as the Dharma. It teaches us about the truth of how things are. Finally, we have glasses of water. We have things. And we call things, everything, even including ephemeral things like thoughts, dharmas. And I think we need to think a little bit about why we do that. Early on, I think the Dharma was considered to be primarily the teachings of the Buddha. The teachings were chanted. They were ultimately, after several hundred years, written down, observed. More teachings came. We speak of the Buddhas and the ancestors, and there's a mass of these teachings. And early on, one of the emphasis in those teachings was, what's the word I want? Not quite asceticism, but control of the senses. The idea was that if craving and clinging were the key elements in our suffering, well, we should get rid of them. We should stop having those disturbing things called passions. And it led to a sort of aversion for the arts. I know I wrote an article a long time ago about the Buddha's great theater of life, and what set me off was something that I read. And here I was working away in the theater, thinking it was wonderfully useful, it was wonderful art, and I came across the Anguttara Nikaya, which says, and I'm going to quote, "As long as they live, the arahants abstain from dancing, singing, instrumental music, and unsuitable shows." Even in the 1980s, when I was practicing at the Toyama Nisodo, we got an opportunity to go to see folk dancing, but it was part of a fair. And as we left, you could look down and there was the midway and all that noise and music and wonderful stuff. And the young priest next to me, the young woman, leaned over and she said, "Only look, only look. We don't do that." And at the same time, I think over all these years since then, at least for me, the answer is non-attachment. It's not to get rid of, but it's to understand and use our passions, but not be attached to them, not be swept away by them. The great fear is that we will somehow lose ourselves. We will be swept away by our response to something. On the other hand, we have to look around ourselves if we're going to understand the truth of how things are. And very early on, the idea was that there were the teachings, what the Buddha said. And so it was considered that only human beings or sentient beings could teach the Dharma. You had to use words, maybe gestures, but only we could reach that. But over time, and there was a huge debate that went on, and you find it in the koan literature, you find it in Dogen, you find the idea that, that insentient beings could not preach or teach the Dharma began to fade, because people began to realize that everything demonstrates the truth of how things are. Everything is impermanent, is dependent upon everything else, and everything speaks and expresses the truth of the emptiness of fixed being. So little by little, people began to understand that rocks and trees and rivers and the sea all, we would say, preached the Dharma. And a Chinese poet in the 11th century, Su Dongpo, wrote a poem that probably many of you are familiar with. And Dogen quotes it in his fascicle on valley sounds and mountain colors in Shobogenzo. And it reads, the poet had spent the night outside in the mountains. And the next morning he wrote, Valley sounds are the long, broad tongue. Mountain colors are no other than the unconditioned body. 84,000 verses are heard through the night. What can I say about this in the future? So we've come to understand that everything can teach us everything, how things really are, their impermanence, their changeability. And also, there's something quite interesting, I think, about the way in which interdependence is demonstrated. Because as things grow, if you take a tree, you put that acorn in the ground, and then there's a little sprout. In fact, I had a discussion with my son yesterday, who lives in Florida, and his neighbor had given him a sprout about that high, maybe, of what's going to be a coconut tree. And he said, I hope I live long enough to see this become a tree, because it will take a lot of time. But we know that that sprout will find, if you will, its fullest expression as a tree. So almost everything finds its self. We tend to be something of an exception to that. As you know from our practice, our own struggles, we don't know as surely what it is to be a human being as even a cat knows what it is to be a cat. We struggle with who we are. We struggle with how we fit in. That coconut tree is going to fit in. There will be nothing else for it to do. For us, we have too many choices. But given this fact that everything is a Dharma, object of art or demonstrations of art are dharmas just as much as trees or cats. But the issue then becomes, I think, what is special about the Dharma teachings of art? Now, art is defined often as creative expression. And what does that really mean when we say creative expression? What defines something created from something that simply is? Why is a painting of a tree or a poem about a tree? I know in Shohako's lectures, he talks about Ryokan writing a poem to a tree, not about it, but to it. But why is that different from the tree itself? What is the thing that makes, I use the word special. Maybe we should say a particular kind of teaching. And I think at one level, it's because, and this is what worried the ancient Buddhists, it engages our senses. Now, so can a beautiful sunset, so can a beautiful sound of a bird singing. But if we don't think about detaching, art will very deeply engage our senses, and it brings us more alive, brings life and color into our lives. We begin to see, hear, taste, touch, everything with greater sensibility. Art also can affect how we see things. I know when I was studying art 65 years ago, whatever, all those years ago, it suddenly became clear to me that one thing that happened in France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was when artists began to think about Impressionism, which later became Expressionism, and they rejected the apparently realistic perspective. I suddenly thought, we actually see things on a single two-dimensional plane. We assume from little signals there's space. What you're seeing right now is just a flat screen. You assume there's space behind me, but you can't sense it in the thing itself. So it began to alter the way, at least for me, that I actually saw things. I saw more in them because I could see what was there, not what was beyond it. But I think the important thing is that unlike ordinary things of the world, art is a kind of message to us from another human being. It offers us a new way of looking at the world. An individual artist's vision confronts us with color, line, rhythm, of speech, sound that maybe we've not yet imagined. It's a kind of offering. It says, here it is. This is how I see things. Maybe you haven't thought of this, but maybe you'd like to open up your mind a little bit. It's uncompromisingly itself. It isn't anything other than what it is. And I suppose this is true of any Dharma, but we need to pay attention to it, face it pretty uncompromisingly and wholeheartedly. And as with any Dharma, but this can be easier to discount because they say, oh, well, that's not natural. That's not what it's really like. Well, we don't know that. We know how we see it. All of which takes us to something that I think you're all familiar with, Seng San's Faith in Mind, which says, attaining the way is not difficult, just avoid picking and choosing. If you have neither aversion nor desire, you'll thoroughly understand. So an artist, I think, is trusting us not to have preconceived notions, not to be able to hear the new language, if you will. Art is a kind of language. It speaks to us. Sometimes, it's criticized as not being real. There's the very famous Zen saying about, a painted rice cake does not satisfy hunger. Well, interestingly enough, Dogen, in one of his very famous fascicles, said that's not enough. That's not a complete understanding of what a painting is. So let's think about it for a minute. Like the tree I keep bringing up, or the cat who just jumped onto my desk. The elements of a painting, let's say in this case, rice paper and paint, are real, and they are speaking to us of impermanence and all the things that came together to make them there. So they're giving us that ordinary message. But I think something else is going on. We cannot eat it, but that's not its purpose. It's the rice cake in the picture points us to the edible object. It raises in our mind the thought of an edible rice cake, the memory of a rice cake, the memory of who we were with when we last ate one. Maybe a little wondering about the recipe. In fact, if we couldn't visualize a rice cake, we couldn't make one. We'd never eat one. And it raises perhaps the issue of, whether I'm hungry right now or not. It represents not just a rice cake, but it represents everything we know about eating, cooking, the elements of food. It's all right there in that little picture of a rice cake. And I think, what the monk who originally said that got into was that mere representation is not fulfilling. This is why so often in our practice, darn it, it is suggested that we must not just think about things, but experience them. Not just read about them, but experience them. At the same time, And it was part of the whole tradition of a separate transmission outside of words and letters. But you know, the fact that the transmission is outside of words and letters doesn't actually say that words and letters are not useful, and maybe indicating that transmission is possible. They go together. And Dogen has often really said that, you know, a word is a Dharma. It's an object like anything else. And like everything else, it has ramifications. But setting aside the it's not real, in the sense of I look at that painting of a sunset and I think, well, that's beautiful, but it's not a real sunset. How I see everything is also an illusion, because I see everything as here, and in this instant, unchanging. But of course, it's actually changing. We had a little discussion yesterday with the group I was studying a book with, that, you know, once you've said something, it's already passed. And the instant that it takes me to say now, time has passed. So we're never quite in the past, the future, or even really quite here. But I think what art offers is, because it's filtered through a human mind, ripples of association, ripples of understanding that are being offered to us. The way in which we hear music, even the way in which we learn to accommodate sound that we thought once was ugly and we no longer do. We begin to accept rhythms that were not familiar to us. This is all a kind of expansion of our lives. And we take pleasure in the connection. So what I want. When we experience art, and I suppose this is also true just with life, but here specifically, I'm receiving a message and I'm pleased to receive it. I'm hearing something. I'm sensing something kinesthetically. I'm visualizing something that is new, because it's not mine originally, but I take it as mine. And that's the gift that comes to me. Because I think there is something new about it, something we haven't experienced. Art is a very important part of our dharmic practice of empathy. It's obvious in things like the profession that I had in the theater. The whole reason there is theater, the whole reason you put on a play, if you will, or these days you make a film or a video, is you're hoping to engage people's feelings with people, situations they might never otherwise encounter. It is bringing us into contact with that whole world that we do inhabit, but we're not aware of, that we're not familiar with it. And there's something wonderful about being encouraged to extend, get out of yourself and wonder about the lives of other people. I remember many, many, many years ago, there was a book called The Family of Man, and it was photographs. I kept it for years, of all kinds of people that I had never encountered and probably never will. And yet, through those photos, the humanity spoke to me. So when we make art, if I am able to write a poem, I'm hoping to engage in a conversation with you, because I hope, until you read it, it just lies there on the page. And it's, I may think it's a good poem or a bad poem, but when you read it, now we're in conversation. So one of the ways, obviously, we talk to each other and we write letters and we send emails. But in, let's say, reading a novel, two things are happening. I am perhaps experiencing a completely different age or time, and I am experiencing it through the eyes of the author. So there is a kind of exchange of understanding here that goes a little bit beyond, my dinner table conversation. Art can be disturbing. It can shake up our preconceived notions of how things should look. I think of all those tomato soup cans, Andy Warhol's. We'd never maybe looked at a soup can in that way. We are asked to, a work of art asks us not only to respond to it, but to accept it. It's a kind of gift. It's a kind of gift. And what makes it wonderful is a gift from another human being to me. And a piece of art has a very interesting sort of dual time thing. It's obvious with something like, let's say you go to the art museum and you see a 16th century portrait of a Dutch burgher. There he is. Well, I'm looking at him now, but I'm seeing then. It's one of the few ways we can see then. It's a few ways we can see other cultures. When you look suddenly at a huge pattern, imageless, of Arabic writing, suddenly it's other than I'm familiar with, and yet it's very beautiful and it's human. So our idea of what humanity is, I think, is that's what I want, is expanded by art. And it doesn't have to be, old masters we're talking about, or highly avant-garde, whatever. It can be as simple as a beautifully crafted object. The old thing of two pieces of pottery are never the same. Well, they're not exactly, if they come from human hands and not a machine. And that becomes important because variety is important in our lives. And our ability to enjoy variety, which is closely allied to, guess what? Change and impermanence. To enjoy the fact of individuality in the midst of our desire to make sure somehow we've got our lives under control. Once you have begun to listen to the offerings of a particular kind of music, your own rhythm changes. Once you have begun to delve into the, what's the word I want? The complexity of references in a piece of poetry, your mind expands. So again, I think what's special about art is that it says you can't understand me unless you try. I mean, a beautiful sunset is somehow expected. It's a world's gift to us, if you will. I'm not by any way denying the beauty of all sorts of natural objects, but I'm speaking here about artist communication. And if you walk through the museum with your preferences in mind, you're going to miss a lot of things. I went to the art museum here recently with a friend who's originally from Venezuela. She's interesting because she's an immigrant here. And in Venezuela, she was a banker, handling, bank loans and whatnot, and quite well-to-do. And she traveled to Europe and, went, she saw the Mona Lisa and all the rest of that. When I first met her, she's now been a little bit promoted, so she's doing administration, but she was scrubbing floors here in the US. But when I discovered it, I was her English teacher for a little bit. We went to the art museum together, and I discovered that she had this huge background in, loving art. But we went through, it turned out she loved the portraits and she loved the landscapes. And we went into a particular section, a collection we have here at the art museum that is filled with magnificent 20th century art. Not all of it abstract, but a fair amount of it. And she said, I don't like that stuff. And I realized she wasn't looking at it because she knew she didn't like it. And I thought, well, it's asking you to look. It's asking you to look. Someone has gone to all the effort to put it there. So you will look. And you're, in a sense, it's like offering a hand, and you hadn't bothered to put yours out too. So, there are all these reasons I think that art is reasonably important. But for me, the most important piece of it all is that it's a message from a creative mind. And the fact that it's a creation of our imagination, this goes for many kinds of what we would call crafts as well as so-called fine arts, but it's a creation of something we knew, we saw, and we brought it into being. It's not simply the result of the universal process of impermanence and interdependence and cause and effect. It shows us, I think, that the human imagination is boundless. It's really thrilling. I may look at a painting and think, boy, I don't like that. But wow, look at what he's saying or she is saying. I'm not sure I like the message. But I never thought a mind could go, or in this case, a vision, because or a vision or a hearing could go that far. We were talking yesterday about the famous John Cage piece in which the piano, the cover of the piano keys was opened, and then nothing happened for a very good long time because the music was the sounds of the people shuffling and wondering and twisting in their seats. Nobody thought to listen to ask you to listen like that. And you can say, well, what in the world was that? So they said, well, didn't you hear it? Didn't you hear it? Well, you didn't listen. But I think it's thrilling to think of the vast expanse of our imagination and how we can use it to interpret the dharmas within which we live and the Dharma, the truth of how things are. It's vaster than we could imagine. And sometimes I find that it makes me think of something very common within Buddhist theory. Many of the sutras speak of the one mind. And I always wondered, why do we call the Dharmakaya, the source, if you will, which is empty, is not there, there's nothing there, and yet it is vast potentiality that realizes itself in this computer and all the things that we have. And while the Dharmakaya has no intention, and I think sometimes even our own creative mind doesn't have intention in that sense, but our mind is a reflection of the same kind of process. So we call this big thing one mind, meaning out of its potential is coming everything. Well, when we see a piece of art, or hear a piece of art, or read words that have meaning, we are realizing that creativity, human creativity, has vast potential. It's the same kind of thing. Potential is being realized, and things we hadn't thought about. I'm not suggesting that my mind is necessarily hooked up to the one mind. It may be a result of it. But what I am saying is that the idea of mind, which has no limits, is nothing in itself, and yet it realizes itself in creation. So the idea that my mind could be more open than it is, actually has more in it, is what I find encouraging, deeply encouraging. And I'm looking here at my own picture, of course, talking to you. And if I move my head, you see those paintings up there above the thing? Those are watercolors called The Hazy Moon of Enlightenment, done originally by a gentleman who was in prison. But I'd never thought of it that way, that there might be clouds over the moon of enlightenment. That's pretty much all I have to say. I'm going to run out of time here shortly. As I said, I think it's hard to talk about art, but I think we can appreciate the gift of it. You know, our life is a gift. Every breath we take is a gift. But beyond that, art is a gift from other human beings, trying to explain it to us. I remember once having someone say that, you know, an artist is a person who can look at the chaos that actually exists and live within it and organize it and give it back to us shaped. So that I think it is wrong if we think of art only as excessive feeling, and we should really be totally plain. We should never get excited about anything. That the idea of dampening down our senses is the way to live fully in the Dharma. I think we have to manage our senses, but we need to sharpen them, not get rid of them. And art helps with that. It helps immensely. So thank you for listening. That's all I really have to say. And I'm hoping you'll have plenty to say. So over and out.
I'll jump right in here. As I think most of you know, I did my my Shuso talks all on the intersection of art and our practice. And it occurs to me again and again how much we separate art from what we actually are, from what our life actually is. And I think of Aboriginal or indigenous cultures that there is absolutely no separation. Everything they make, everything they do, they're totally absorbed in. And so I tend to think about practice in the same way that I think about art. Is it requires a total absorption.
Yep.
Whether you're viewing it, enjoying it, making it your own life, the absorption to get the most out of everything should be total.
Yep.
And I always go back to, I know I've said this 1,000 times, and one talk or another, or I know I said it during my Shuso talks, it was about John Cage's experience talking about going into the studio with the weight of the world on your shoulders, and as you begin to make art, you start to cast off, and eventually it comes down to you and the work, and then if you're lucky, you leave. And that speaks to me most about how practice works as well.
Mm-hmm.
Total absorption. Well, I guess that's all I have to say at this moment. So.
Well, I agree entirely. And because the answer is that in going toward whatever that creative impulse is, you're forgetting yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in forgetting the self that we truly become, oddly enough. So I agree entirely. I was speaking as a spectator. I'm not an artist. You know, I'm speaking as, if you will, a consumer, not a doer. But anything we do that allows us to go get over ourselves is practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, anybody else? I'm sure somebody agrees or disagrees or whatever.
Hi, just maybe a brief comment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yep. I can't see you though. Oh, there you are.
Yeah. So I'm a musician. One interesting thing about the experience of interdependence, for example, and especially across generations and centuries. So these days, if I'm performing a piece by, let's say, Beethoven,
Mm-hmm.
Beethoven's music completely depends on me, for example, in this case, being here and now to bring his message
Mm-hmm.
to life and to communicate it with people, to offer it to people. I also completely need that listener, that receiver on the other side, here and now. So there is this connection, this very close, and I can add to this many specific elements, you know, the piano. We have a different piano today than the kind of piano Beethoven did. We have different concert halls or different acoustics. These days we offer concerts online since last March. So there are many, many different elements. And yet, you know, Beethoven's work, which is so meaningful, I think, for so many people, certainly this is my life now, cannot possibly be at all. You know, without all those different elements, it's just ink on a piece of paper. It's not actually realized. It's not actually music. And at the same time, the way that it may be performed today and the way that it may be heard today, listened to today, and received today is so completely different
Mm-hmm.
than the way it was 200 years, and yet incredibly valid. And it's when you spoke about, you know, art as a kind of human communication. So for me, this is maybe one of the most revealing types of human communication, and maybe art in general, that one can express something, and even in a situation like this, across generations, through such different medium, still is so alive and vibrant and teaches us so much about ourselves through something, in my case, music, but you know, other things that are art as well. So it's kind of an incredible thing, I think, this process of art, and for me, it's very directly related to the practice
Mm-hmm.
of Zazen and Dharma. I sometimes, over the years, I've kind of noticed that there's less and less separation even.
Mm-hmm.
And just one comment about 433, John Cage. is that there's so many different ways of thinking of that particular work or experiment, or however one wants to address it or think about it. But one that I've considered recently is that there's something about that piece, 433, that forces us to listen to something at the present moment. And when we, again, if I use Beethoven as an example again, sometimes when people go to a concert, they think, oh, here's Beethoven. This piece was written 200 years ago. So there is that gap, there's this distance. But what John Cage is doing by using 433 is one possible understanding of it, is that, I think, is that it says whatever is happening right now is happening right now. So even if I'm playing that Beethoven sonata that was written a long time ago, right now, the experience is complete as it is at this very moment. So whatever it is, and including, if there are birds that sound that comes through the window while the Beethoven is happening, both are happening at once, and that's the experience. So yeah, I mean, I love 433, and there's so many different ways of thinking about it. So I'm just very happy that you brought it up.
Well, to me, you've said something really important, I think, about the fact that art as expressed, particularly in music, is always happening now. And for example, I'm always, in my case, it was actually no drama, but I know people do this at the opera as well. But I was in Japan and I was going to go to see the first no drama I'd ever seen. And I looked and there were all these people with the libretto, if you will. They're all sitting there, sort of, I suppose, comparing if the actor up there is intoning the right word. I'm not quite sure what they were doing, but I thought, they're not listening. They've brought the drama with them in that book and in their head. Now they're comparing, so that it takes, as I think we do in Zazen, where we let go of thoughts in a sense, it takes letting go of whatever preconceived notion you have about Beethoven, let's say, the whole how he should be played or not played. You let go of that when you're attending. I know I spent all those years in the theater, and I used to be startled because I would go to big theater conferences, and they usually happened at somebody's theater. And of course, we used to joke and saying you were doing the one flop of the season when you had the entire profession there, but whatever it was. But nevertheless, you would go to a play, a performance, and I would, theater has technique, just as anything has technique. And so I would sit there with all my counterparts and people saying, well, the lighting's not very good. I think the director's pacing is off. They're dealing with all the technical details. I remember one time I turned around and said to somebody, look, couldn't you just watch the play? I know all, I'm in the same profession, I can do all that, but can you let go of that? Because it's happening right now in front of you, and it's up to you to receive its message, not pull the feathers off it, so to speak. So art is not something that, actually, I was thinking about what you talked about the music. We don't own it in the sense that we can't keep it with us. I can't go knowing the mechanics, or I can't go with a preconceived notion of what it should sound like. And I can't go with a preconceived notion about what painting should be or sculpture should be. It really asks us to let go if we're going to engage with it and think if this is a message. But I love what you say about playing the Beethoven in the here and now. It's perfect. It's just perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
So recently I've been I wrote a paper, I'm in a religious studies program, and I wrote this paper sort of comparing Shinran, the founder of the Jodo Shinshu, one of the Pure Land schools in Japan. And he's sort of famous for, you know, kind of eschewing a lot of the priestly expectations and, you know, preaching directly to sort of normal Japanese people, whereas Dogen, you know, I think we sort of have to admit was kind of an elitist. You know, he wrote primarily for very well-educated people, and we don't really have any evidence of him, you know, speaking to sort of normal folk. He was kind of stuck in this high society kind of class. And we see this, I think, in his writing, like Shobogenzo, which certainly is art, and requires quite a bit of kind of training to understand and appreciate. So one sort of concern that I think, you know, has arisen recently in our various sanghas is Soto Zen in a way sort of elitist through kind of art. So I'm curious what you think about that, the relationship between art and elitism and exclusion of people maybe not trained to understand it.
That's a great question. And I'm not sure I'm going to answer it directly, maybe kind of in a roundabout way. I think Soto Zen or Buddhism or art criticism or being an aficionado of jazz, it's always elitist if you have to be an aficionado. In other words, if there's a special language, a special understanding that requires study, which is not to say that learning, let's say, Dogen's language or the language of Buddhism is not necessary or useful. But I think it's really important that we who are we practice Soto Zen, don't hide behind the, what's the word I want, the manifestations, the jargon. I was enormously helped in that respect by spending 17 years inside, and now I still am working with 7 or 8 prison inmates, discovering that I had to explain the Dharma as it is lived in our lives without relying on quoting difficult passages or set pieces or using words that were unfamiliar. Although over time, often certain words, certainly Dharma, you know, people begin to understand those bits of language. But I don't think Soto Zen is elitist at all. I found nothing of that within the people I worked with who are not highly educated. And you got to remember, education has nothing to do with intelligence. It just doesn't. People tend to think if they've been to college or whatnot, they're more intelligent. Not necessarily at all. Fact is, one of the best instincts about the truth of Zen was given to me by an African-American Black inmate who he was not uneducated. He was not close to illiterate, as many inmates are, but he was certainly not highly educated at all. And I was having a pastoral visit with him one day, and he said, "Tonen, you're always talking to us about, you know, we should live in the now, but aren't we always living in the past?" And I thought, holy smoke. He got it in one. You know, that whatever we are expressing is just a little behind us. I don't think Soto Zen is elite unless we, how do I put it? We make it into a kind of cultural barrier, which is easy to do. I mean, people don't want to come into the zendo because they're not sure they're going to do the right thing or wear the right thing or say the right thing or sit in the way they should. And how to encourage practice, I mean, how to offer practice that does include the important elements like sitting without making it seem precious is something we have to avoid. I mean, if Zen is worth anything, if Zazen is worth anything, Ideally, a very large number of people should sense its benefit when they sit down. It has nothing to do with being special. It has today the assumption on the part of most of our culture that it is somehow still Asian. I had somebody tell me once I couldn't be a Buddhist because I wasn't Asian. And that therefore it's somehow alien. I think that's diminishing. And again, I never got that, oddly enough, in prison. They were glad I was there and wanted to tell them something or other. I showed up, which was the biggest part of it all. But you have to try to explain what's going on without relying on, I mean, I only quote Dogen if it seems germane at the moment, you know, and he often does. But example, I'm doing every Tuesday evening, Tonen and Jim, who are on here today, know, I ended up doing a thing called Dharma discussion every Tuesday evening on Zoom, of course, with a group of people. And it started after I had been offering Zazen at a local Presbyterian church. I got kind of bored of my life and I thought, well, I should go back into action. So we did. And then, you know, this hit. So they said, well, you know, could we get, okay, we'll Zoom. So now we have maybe 10 people involved. And of them, 3 are former prison inmates, 3 or 4. And they had practiced with me. And then there are people like Tonen, who's an ordained priest. But a whole bunch of them were people that were just kind of curious. So I started out the first time and I sent people the Heart Sutra. And what I got back was, listen, it's full of funny words. I don't get it. You know, what does all that mean? And I said, all right, you got to learn the vocabulary. So for weeks now, I've run out of them finally, but I've been taking words like Sangha, words like Dharma, words like awakening, you know, night by night to figure them out. So now they have the vocabulary and it no longer seems the least bit. We're moving on from that now. So all I can say is I don't think Soto Zen is elitist unless we make it so. It may be considered so whether we like it or not. We can't help that. But any group that has I'll give an example, that is distinctive will seem resistant to outsiders. I'll give you an example. I've been quite a supporter of a group here in Milwaukee called Block. Black Lives something community, organizing community. And it's a group of largely African-American women that have been going around, not so directly now, but in the African-American community, trying to convince people to vote and listening to them and dragging white politicians with them to listen to the guy on the street. And I really love them, but I can't join them because I'm not them. You know, they are in their own way as closed a group as some people may feel the zendo is. So I'm not giving you much of an answer, but I think it's up to us to not believe it is because we're involved and we have degrees and we're white and we're smart, you know, and only us can get it. It ain't so. I promise you it's not so. I mean, it's been demonstrated to me over years of people, including some people that could barely read. They got it. You know, it wouldn't be around this long if it didn't have something, but we have to be careful about how our own enthusiasms are expressed. Enough, sorry, you got me in my soapbox. Thank you. Thank you a lot, Doji. Does that help at all? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe just, you know, at Sanshinji, we spend so much time with Dogen
Sure.
that it seems more that way, but I certainly agree with you that it doesn't have to be.
I mean, you know, Dogen himself, again, it depends on how you approach him. You can, I was gonna say translate, but you know, if there's stuff there that's meaningful, it's got to be meaningful in ordinary language. But we don't always, we're not thrust into situations where we're talking to anybody but ourselves. You know, I can talk to you about what phenomenology and you're going to understand what I'm saying. But that's not the point of being together with people and trying to reach them. It's tough. I think it's tough. And I agree about the Dogen aspect of it. It's a lot of head stuff. Sort of head and butt, basically. So, enough. Anybody else?
I just wanted to add a little note aimed at Doju primarily, just to remind you that it was a small thing for you, I'm sure, but one evening earlier in my experience, I encountered the word suchness, I think, and
Help.
I was bewildered and expressed that. And you, Doju, and Sagan chuckled, I mean, very easily and warmly, and just informed me that I just had to learn this basic vocabulary in Zenese. And then you gave me a couple of examples and we moved on. But it was a wonderful moment for me. And you, just so that you know, you just did it in a way that it was light and easy and inviting. Nice. And not about esotericism. So thank you.
That's a really important point, that, you know, not what, you're not dumb if you don't understand the language. Maybe who have spent time in countries where you didn't speak the language realize how dumb you seem to people. You know, you occasionally want to jump up and down and say, well, I have all, you know, in my own language, I understand all this stuff. And you can talk like a 3-year-old kind of. But that's a really important thing, that not understanding the words is not a big deal. You'll get it, you know, somebody will show you. All right, are we okay here?
Can I jump in for one more thing?
Sure.
Maybe? Just to back up a little bit, there was a point where you touched on preciousness.
Yes.
And I think it's a really important point. I remember one of my painting teachers telling us how important it was to get rid of that preciousness, to feel like you're making something precious. And this, in fact, I think crosses into our practice. I think everybody kind of goes through a honeymoon period and you feel like you're doing something wonderful.
Yeah.
And so it offers the opportunity to honestly screw up, honestly find your way.
Yep.
To look at it as nothing special, therefore nothing's hidden. And we're in that realm of good for nothing, Zen. But we can also look at the other side of that and be able to open up and see something that, like you were talking about being at a play and people picking it apart, to finally see something for what it is, or to experience it for exactly what it is. So just to throw that out there.
That's great. And I think also that I liked so much what was said about, you know, in presenting Beethoven, it is, you are the instrument, if you will. And you're here now in this time and not necessarily back, you know, when he lived. We get to issues saying, you know, I think, oh, that's just old music. We get too put off by indications that come from other times or other places or other cultures. And we think, you know, I can't, let's say, in this case, you know, you can't be a Buddhist because you're not Asian. I mean, you can't do that. And I do remember a startling experience I had with they should be nameless, but some other actually Soto Zen priests. We were having a meeting, it was many years ago, at Milwaukee Zen Center. And I suppose we were all in some way in Roxu and whatnot, but nothing else much. And I have no memory of how it came up, but what I remember was one of them saying, and I knew this was true because they wore Okesa with blue jeans. He was saying, I'm not going to wear all that dad-ratted Japanesey stuff. And what came out of my mouth was, oh, I thought when I put it on, it was American. So think about that for a minute. You know, the clothing and the practice becomes us. And if you are, to what I want, the practice is who you are, regardless of what you wear or where you are. This was so vivid to me in working with the prison sanghas, that we were practicing. They had on their prison greens and I had on samway, and that was all there was to it. It had nothing to do with the fact that many of them, some of them couldn't sit, and I had to sit in a chair, but you know, we're happy to sit on the floor and zazen and all the rest without thinking about whether it was not theirs. It's always ours if we treat it that way. And we don't signal to people that we're robing ourselves in something strange and mysterious. Because this has nothing to do with who I am. I remember once driving down to Racine Correctional, which was Racine is rather close to Milwaukee, and I used to drive 3 hours out to prisons. Well, this place was close, so it's where I was most likely to be late. You know, I'd cut it too fine. And I got into my car and I'm tearing down the road and I thought, I forgot my rock, so I can't teach. Well, I mentioned it to the guys when I got there, and of course they howled. You know, this has nothing to do with it. It's to remind me what I think I'm trying to do in my life, but that's kind of all. So preciousness is a terrible danger because it separates ourselves. You know, so we can't be part of whatever it is that's happening. I have to say, my other bugaboo about this, and I've had a lot of friends who did it. I lived for 6, 7, 8 years of my life in what was largely a Black community. And I spent many years of my life producing Black theater, you know, plays written by Black authors and with actors and so on. What I cannot abide is when white people try to be part of it by talking Black. I cannot stand it because it's precious. It's an assumption. You know, you speak as who you are. Sorry, it just bugs me. I also had a very wonderful experience with a Black guy who was an organizer in Cincinnati, and he was going to rent our small theater. And he came in to me spouting, they used to call it Black English, but you know, spouting the whole jargon. I looked him in the eye and I said, look, I know you're bilingual. Would you mind speaking to me in ordinary English? Because I don't always get that. And he dropped right into ordinary English. And he was the only person we rented that theater to ever who paid me advance in cash. You know, it was a wonderful moment. But we don't pretend to be who we're not. So this can't be a pretense. You know, it can't be, it doesn't make me special, ever. And in fact, for those who are ordained, and I think for all of us, even if we just, you know, take the precepts and down the Roxu, it says it's not about you anymore. It's about everybody else and what you can do for the rest of the world. To be committed is not to be special. It genuinely is, especially for those who take ordination, it is not about you. It may have been about you for a long time and finding your way and so on. But, you know, these, as we take them, the precepts for me say, I'm letting go of assumptions about myself. Not that I'm donning something special. You run into all kinds of problems that seem to be badges of specialness. And I couldn't agree with Hoshin more. Preciousness is a danger because we think that if we imitate the container, we've got it. Well, I tell you, there's nothing there. And I don't mean emptiness. I mean, it's just hollow, you know. You can't do it by imitating it. And preciousness is part of the urge to make yourself very special. And I'm an artist. People who talk about being artists an awful lot often are not. Really? You know, we are what we do, not how we describe ourselves. Sorry. I'm soapboxing again. You got to kick it out from underneath me. Anybody else?
Yes, I had a question that might be slightly malformed, but just a thought that came up, which was, I know that a lot of times, or I'm thinking about our relationship to art and how like it can be healthy or unhealthy. Like there's a lot of people nowadays, and probably also historically, where people use art as a escape mechanism to try to get away from their problems. It's very common with video games and television and film, but also reading and stuff like that. And I guess I'm wondering, like, since art can be a positive way to build empathy and understand the world, and so on, like on the opposite side of that, how do we know, or at least try to figure out if our relationship to art is like built upon a healthy or unhealthy mindset, I guess is what I was wondering. Thank you.
That's a great question. I suppose, art in a way is an escape. It's an escape from yourself into something else. And particularly if it is, video games, theater, reading, novels. It takes you someplace other than where you are. So I guess I have to say whether part of its proportion, how often do you take a break, if you will, from your life as it is and go there? And is it having any impact on the times when you're not escaping? If I'm making any sense, in terms of healthy, are you learning something from it? And I mean, you don't always know that, but I think there's nothing wrong with bowing out every once in a while and not being, intensely engaged at all moments. I read a lot of mysteries, but they don't dominate my life, and I don't need them. So maybe part of the little rule of thumb you use for yourself is, am I attached to this? Am I addicted to this? Is it the one place I feel good? Or is it simply a pleasurable piece of my life? Because I don't think in and of themselves, those things are bad, by any means bad. But it's the issue of attachment to being connected only in your head. We talk about virtual reality all the time. It really scares me that a lot of people seem to live in virtual reality, which means nothing when the power goes off. Thank you very much. Is that at all helpful? I understand it is a question.
Yeah, I have a thought about that, if I may, Tonen. Yeah, I my relationship with art has been complicated. It was my only natural skill, my best natural skill as a kid. And then when I went and pursued a science career, it became this thing on the side that I could do. And when I would have for free time, I would do a piece of art, which is very rare in training, but when I would do a piece of art, I was so attached to the concept that it had to be good, sort of to prove to myself that I still had it, you know, I could still do this. And it set up a very unhealthy relationship with art for me, where it became about producing something good rather than the joy and the fun I had when I was younger and did things. And I took a class not long ago, but I took a class where the teacher told me like two things, which he had above his art area, which is, I walked into the studio today, so something good will happen. And then secondly, any mark is better than no mark. So I had all this sort of pressure to make something good and would stare at things or just not do anything. So that helped break me out of it, because like Tonen was saying, like I'd just go in and put something down, or he would say like, leave something unfinished, or when you're done a piece, like do something small and then pick it up the next day. And then it became a dialogue. It's sort of like you put the mark, then what is the mark telling you to do? And then it sort of goes from there. And I found that so helpful, because it got me away from, you know, I have to do something good. And so, but that dialogue, and and I love how you said, Tonen, like, when it's sort of the giver, receiver, and gift triad, right? So like, you know, you see a piece of art, it's holding its hand out to you to interact, and then you get into it. It's sort of the same way with creating it, I think. Thank you.
That's really wonderful, because it means a couple of things, I think. One is that art, if you're an artist, you don't view it as self-validation. It's not self-validation. It is you responding to the messages, if you will, that are coming through your own talent, you know, through how you see, how you hear, how you think. And you are responding to that to then share that. But if it becomes, I thought about people that describe themselves too readily as artists, I often think, well, you think that's how you become important. It's not. It's how you communicate. That's very helpful. And you should know, actually, those of you that when Shohaku Okamura Roshi's book on Ryokan finally comes out, the sections will be divided by artwork by the person who just spoke.
Looking forward to it.
Hi, everybody. Lisa, what's kind of funny is I'm one of those odd people that really believes scientists are nothing but artists in another form.
Yeah.
There's so many wonderful things to respond to. I mean, good gosh. I had to chuckle when you mentioned phenomenology, because of my phenomenology literature is like on the third shelf over here.
Uh-huh.
The deeper I study Buddhism, the more I want to relearn phenomenology and study it even more.
Go for it.
It's kind of odd, but then, you know, realistically, as I'm listening to all of us talk about art and the relationship between the artist, the work, and the receiver, you know, I'm just looking at the hermeneutic circle all over again, and it's actually a wonderful parallel to absorption and just, you know, being now. But, you know, as someone who is trained as a philosopher, so I have to come up with a counter to something here that I have to add. And it begs a question for me to think about as well. When you're talking about the burger painting, you know, the painting of a burger, first thing I thought of was an actual burger. And I think it's actually quite apropos because, you know, you said to look, you know, you're looking now, but you're seeing then.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the problems that I see with art is that it brings in the danger of reintroducing a permanent thing. Oh, that's what this piece of work is, this artwork is about.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Romanian poet that was on NPR. I don't know if he still is. I can't pronounce his name, but he had wonderful accent and wonderful poetry. And I remember one article he gave where he discussed how you should reinterpret poetry every 5 years.
Sure.
Because as we live, our ideas about things change.
Mm-hmm.
And the work, a piece of work takes on different significance. So, you know, I often wonder what kind of, you know, you look at what's famous now for art, what people really appreciate, and whether or not that will stand the test of time. You know, what I was just watching The Day the Earth Stood Still, the remake from like 2008, and the alien was listening to Bach, and I'm thinking, well, maybe in the future, you know, maybe he was in Icelandic Sweden, instead of Bach, it would have been death metal.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
So there's a certain sense to where, you know, art, you know, when we talk about art, we talk about art in the now, and when we do that, that brings in what we are now.
Sure.
And then,
absolutely.
And then all the complexities with the Buddhist concept of time.
You bet. Well, the difficulty is that, that's a great question or comment. Time doesn't exist except as being. And so the only time that's involved, if I look at that, let's say Rembrandt painting, is now. So whatever it meant then to him or the guy who commissioned it, you know, or to, you know, if you look at the Northern Renaissance things, I'm trying to think his name, Van Eyck, they're always the little donors, and you know, the donor of the painting is kind of down here, a couple of little rich guys, because they have to be in the painting. It's the Trinity or something, but you know, there they are. I have no idea what Rembrandt thought. I have no idea what the guy, let's say in the portrait, was like, really. All I know is my response to what I see there. Now, it may involve a lot of ideas I have about the past, but it's all happening right now. So I don't think it's only if we ourselves cling to something. In other words, we say, this is great art, you know? And then 100 years from now, they look at it and think, what do they think? Maybe they think because everybody said for 100 years it was great art. They say, oh, it is great art. And somebody said, the emperor has no clothes on. Today it's junk. I don't get it. I can't hear it. So I think the danger is not in the object itself. It's in our response to it. And, you know, certain forms of seeing or hearing or writing, fads and what is popular, I say fads, but there are changing waves of what we respond to. So you're right about death metal, you know? I've always been very interested because my husband, and this goes, we were married in 1955, so this goes back to the beginnings of rock and roll. He loved Italian opera and he hated rock and roll. And he used to call it bumpa flappa, bumpa flappa, bumpa flappa, bumpa flappa. And I was laughing because now we have, a rock and roll museum. We have, it's become enshrined as a form of music that actually seems old to us now, a little bit. So I think all we need to do is trust yourself when you look at something, because you're the one now. You were saying, I think, Mark, that, again, the whole hermeneutical circle, if it obtains for everything in my everyday life, it's got to obtain for me when I face that. I hear that music, I read that poem, I face that painting. It is all a contemporary transaction, I think. But only if we have a preconceived notion. I've got to like this because it's great. I will confess something to you once. When I was in art history way back in, about 1952, I suppose, I was taking art history seminar, and I hated Rubens. I just didn't get it, all that fleshy color. And I kind of timidly in a seminar said, I don't really like him. And the professor said, look, you don't have to like Rubens at all. You do have to understand why he's considered a great artist, in the sense of the technical aspects of it. And I think we need to be careful, we don't have to like it all. The message that's coming through is not one you particularly enjoy. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, nor because you adore it, does it mean it's, quote, good. It has to do with personal preference a lot. I later saw, actually, I went to a meeting in Sarasota where there was a museum that had some enormous Rubens. And of course, the paintings are huge. When I finally stood there and looked at them in full size, suddenly it all made sense to me. I've been looking at the little picture in the book, and it didn't work that way. But you bring up questions about, they're good questions.
And you also just gave a really good definition of Daishin. I don't have to like it, but you see the wonder, you see the joy and the beauty in it.
Yeah, you do. I mean, it's the famous thing, the Buddha said, don't believe it because everybody says so. Well, you don't have to like it because everybody says so. But you may want to, for your own benefit, kind of figure out, why do they like, why does everybody like it and I don't? I mean, what are the elements that are there? Because everything that comes into our life, whether it's art or something else, we can attempt to explore, understand it or not, and it's okay also to sometimes not. I'll give you an example. I've done an absolutely insane thing. At the age of 88, I start next Wednesday an online course given by a professor from my own college, old college, Swarthmore, in James Joyce's Ulysses. And I read Portrait of the Artist in prep, and I thought, I do not like Stephen Dedalus. I don't like him. So now I'm starting to wade through Ulysses and thought, well, all the word association is fine, but on the other hand, I'm going to take the course and try to figure out why people find riches there. Not because it's difficult, but I sort of think, going pooey, I can read this, but I don't care for it. So I think, and yes, if you're studying Buddhism, read phenomenology. They're related, I think. So there. I started with phenomenology, not understanding it at all, but it's probably what prepped me for Buddhism. It's we're going to say they're kind of going. It's also this is the digression, but it's so interesting to me to see how often human beings have made similar attacks on understanding. I've been reading, actually on Kindle, but an immense book on ancient philosophies, I think it's called. And the guy who's the author begins to get into comparisons of all things between Plato and Hindu and Buddhist concepts of time and other things. And because he didn't decide one was, you know, Eastern and one was Western, and he looked at them, I thought, they are all trying to get at the same thing. You know, we have a handful of enormous questions, and we come at them from different cultural and time, you know, centuries and so on. And we all are sort of bashing away at, and I'm not saying that we agree or it's all one thing, but it fascinates me that everywhere in time and in many cultures, we keep attacking similar issues of what existence is. It made it wonderfully interesting and encouraging a bit, because nobody's quite figured it out yet, so I don't feel so bad.
Is there anybody else?
Got anything?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for that talk. I just came here to train as an opera singer at the school here in Bloomington. And it was a good framework for me. I've been interested in Buddhism and meditation, but I haven't really practiced with a group before. But it was you know, the one thing that kind of turned me off to Buddhism is that kind of very ascetic, you know, I don't know, disinterest in the senses and in beauty and art and whatnot. But so that was a really interesting perspective that you gave on the connection, how it and you know, opera is so not aesthetic, it's so lavish, but the actual practice of it, of singing in that way and whatnot, it requires so much presence and sharpening of your senses, and in a way I kind of think of it as a almost like a tantric practice or a yoga, because it's these blown up emotions that are kind of sublimated into something different that people enjoy, like pain and, you know, all these things, melodrama that people just sit back and take in as a pleasurable experience in the moment.
The opera is, I'm sorry, but from my husband, I learned to adore Italian opera, and you should know that both my sons were bounced on my knees to La Donna Immobile. It makes a wonderful child think. But I also remember something just in this business about being precious. You know, today we tend to think of opera as being difficult, being, you know, all those things. And certainly there are forms of opera that wake you up, make you think. But certainly Italian opera, after I graduated from Swarthmore, between there and going to graduate school, I got a job as a drama counselor at a very fancy girls' camp in Maine. And I used to, there was a little building that had a little stage, you know, I used to have the kids do scenes and stuff on the stage. And I was in that building one day, and there was a guy who was a cook. And he was there, and he was playing some form of Italian opera, probably Verdi. He was on the piano, and I was sort of dancing around on stage, and he said, "Hey, little girl, come over here." And what he said was, he said, "You know," he said, "you got to promise me you will go to Rigoletto before you die." I'm going, I knew from nothing much about, my mother was a contralto, and I used to listen to the opera on the radio. Actually, those days it was people like Lily Pones, and it was fine. And then I'm digressing now, but I found recordings of Emilita Gallicurci and Caruso, and boy, oh boy, scratchy or not, you know. But he said, "I want you to know," he said, "the thing about opera's for the people." He said, "because anybody can sing these, these tunes, and anybody understands those emotions." And this was a guy, he was a merchant marine, and he cooked for the camp in his off time. And I thought, right. Today we think it's, special, high art. Mm-hmm. But opera has the force of nature. I mean, opera is wonderful, all of it, every kind of it. So I honor you. I have to say that And again, to turn dire human emotion into something we can feel and appreciate without being drowned by it. And that's, you know, those big, everybody's dying. And it's part of it's the musical chord. I remember going into, there was a movie I went to years ago when I was married, and my husband and I were going to this thing about the publishing house that published, you know, Verdi and Puccini and all those folks. And it was just a thinly veiled thing to allow them to throw in scenes from all these, you know, operas. We walked in at the end of the first show. We wanted to get a good seat, and of course it was the climax, and the tail end of La Boheme was playing, all those great crashing chords, and I started to sniffle. And my husband said, "God damn it, you haven't even seen the movie." And I don't care, you know, because it elicits response. Theater does the same thing. You know, it allows us to approach unbearable things bearably, so do novels. And for the same way, if you look at Guernica, you know, the painting, it is a teaching in that sense as well. So good luck with your opera training. That's
Thank
great.
you. I'm actually going to do La Boheme next semester.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So,
people like me sniffling at the end.
thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.